The final 24 hours of history's most infamous wives. A gunshot echoes through a concrete bunker. A firing squad raises their rifles. Bodies hang from a gas station in a public square. These are the final moments of three women who stood beside dictators as their empires crumbled into ash. History remembers the men who reshaped nations through force and ideology. But in their final hours, when power dissolved and armies closed in, these dictators were not alone. Standing beside them were their wives, women whose names would become intertwined with the darkest chapters of the 20th century. Some faced execution, others threw themselves into the flames. A few ended their lives by poison capsule as soldiers stormed the gates. What happened during those last 24 hours? What were their thoughts as the world they had known began its final descent? The stories of three women during history's most dramatic final days reveal the human drama behind the headlines and expose the terrible price paid when devotion to a dictator becomes absolute. Beneath Berlin, the marriage that lasted 40 hours. Beneath the smoking ruins of Berlin, in a reinforced concrete bunker buried 50 feet underground, Eva Braun stood in a modest room decorated with furniture stripped from the Reich Chancellery. Above ground, the sound of Soviet artillery grew louder by the hour. The Red Army had reached the Potsdamer Platz, less than a kilometer away. Within days, perhaps hours, soldiers would be walking through these corridors. This was April 29, 1945. Eva had lived a hidden life for 16 years. Adolf Hitler kept her upstairs when visitors called. She never appeared at state functions. The German people barely knew she existed. 16 years of waiting in shadows, in mountain retreats, in isolated villas. Then, defying Hitler's explicit orders, she had traveled to Berlin. She refused to leave him now. Hitler, at 56 years old, looked decades older. He shuffled when he walked. His left hand trembled noticeably. His voice, once commanding and forceful, had become weak and uncertain. Yet in the early hours of April 29th, he made a decision that had eluded him throughout the Nazi era. He married Eva Braun. The ceremony was brief. A city administrator named Walter Wagner officiated. The couple declared themselves to be of pure Aryan descent, free from hereditary disease, the legal prerequisites for Nazi marriage. Eva wore a dark dress. Hitler wore his gray uniform. Those who witnessed it, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's secretaries, a handful of military staff, stood solemnly as the words were spoken. Minutes later, there was a modest wedding breakfast. Champagne was located. Someone found small cakes. In a bunker surrounded by the collapse of their world, this small celebration carried an eerie, desperate quality. After breakfast, Hitler took his secretary, Traudl Junge, to another room and dictated his final will and testament. It was methodical, bureaucratic, almost absurdly formal given the circumstances. He outlined who would succeed him. He ordered immediate execution of certain individuals. He reiterated his hatred for those he believed had betrayed him. Junge, her hands steady despite the surreal circumstances, typed out his words. Hitler signed the documents at 4 a.m. on April 29th. Then he went to bed. When dawn broke on April 30th, 1945, the bunker was already in a state of heightened tension. During the night, news had arrived from Italy. Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, Hitler's only real ally, the man who had ruled for 20 years alongside him, had been captured by partisans and executed. More devastating, Mussolini and his mistress, Clara Petacci, had been hung upside down in a public square in Milan. Crowds had beaten their bodies. Women fired pistols into the corpses. The image sent a chill through the bunker. One officer later said the news had crystallized Hitler's resolve. This would not be his fate. He would not be paraded through the streets. He would not hang from a rope for mobs to desecrate. By late morning, Russian forces had advanced to within a few blocks of the Reich Chancellery. Artillery shells struck the building above. Dust filtered down through the ventilation system. The sounds of battle echoed through concrete corridors. Messages arrived at the bunker. The situation was hopeless. General Helmuth Weidling, commander of Berlin's defensive forces, informed Hitler that ammunition would run out within hours. Fighting would be finished within 24 hours. Hitler did not respond to Weidling's request to attempt a breakout. Permission was eventually granted. Not that it mattered. Around 1 p.m., Hitler ordered his cook to prepare lunch. The meal was simple: pasta, vegetables, whatever could be scrounged from bunker supplies. Hitler ate very little. He pushed most of it around his plate. Beside him, Eva ate with more appetite, though still modest. Those who saw them noted something almost surreal. They behaved like an ordinary married couple having lunch, despite the explosions rocking the building above them. At approximately 2 p.m., Hitler began moving through the bunker, saying goodbye. He went from room to room, shaking hands with staff members. He said a few words to each. He thanked them. He offered encouragement. One secretary noted he moved from person to person with the demeanor of someone who had accepted what was coming. The trembling had stopped. He was calm. He saved Eva for last. In front of witnesses, he embraced her. To those watching, his farewell was tender. He held her close. The woman who had waited in isolation for 16 years, who had given up her life to be near him, who had insisted on following him into the bunker against his wishes. He held her as if, finally, at the end, she mattered. Then, saying that she had been the only good thing in his life, he took her back into his private study. Eyewitnesses would later report that Eva wore a blue silk dress. Her hair was artificially blonde, perfectly set. She had taken time to dress carefully. One man noted her appearance with stark sadness. She seemed to have prepared meticulously for this final day, as if order and grooming mattered now. A few minutes after they entered the study, the sounds stopped. A gunshot. Then silence. The staff waited. Nobody moved. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, Adolf Hitler's valet, Heinz Linge, gathered his courage and entered the study with Otto Günsche, Hitler's SS adjutant. What they found would become the most documented moment of the Nazi era's end. Hitler sat nearly upright on a small sofa, dead from a single gunshot to the right temple. A Walther pistol lay on the floor beside him. Eva lay nearly reclining on the sofa, her head near his chest. She had bitten down on a cyanide capsule. The smell of almonds, the unmistakable odor of cyanide, filled the small room. Hitler's body smelled of gunpowder. Eva's lips showed the faintest discoloration from the poison. They had timed it so they would die together. Within minutes, Linge and Günsche wrapped the bodies in blankets. Hitler's driver, Erich Kempka, assisted. They carried the wrapped corpses through an emergency exit to the small garden behind the Reich Chancellery. Above ground, Soviet artillery continued its relentless bombardment. The shells came so rapidly that moving above ground was terrifying. Yet there, in that garden, the bodies were placed. Someone located petrol, gasoline used for vehicles. They poured it over the bodies. One of the men struck a match. What followed was described by one witness as a scene from hell itself. The bodies did not burn cleanly or quickly. The flesh resisted the flames. Hitler's shin bones remained visible even after hours of burning. More petrol was poured repeatedly. The mourners who had gathered, a small group of the last loyalists, stood at attention and gave the Nazi salute. Then they returned to the bunker, leaving the charred remains in the garden. Before midnight, as Soviet forces drew nearer to the bunker complex itself, the partially burned remains were placed in a bomb crater and covered with soil. What little survived of Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun was buried there, in the garden of the Reich Chancellery, as the Third Reich died around them. Eva Braun had managed to spend her final day as something she had never been in life, the acknowledged wife of the Führer. She died holding that status for less than 18 hours. Those last few hours together, from the wedding breakfast, through lunch, through the goodbyes, through that final moment in the study, may have been the only period in 16 years when her relationship to Hitler was open and recognized. She had taken her blue silk dress and dressed carefully for her last day. She had her hair done. She was present for the farewells, acknowledged by the inner circle. Then she chose to end it rather than face what came next. The farmhouse on Lake Como, love and execution. While Hitler and Eva Braun were preparing their final moments in the Berlin bunker, thousands of kilometers away, another pair faced their own reckoning. Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator who had ruled for 20 years, was still alive. He was 56 years old, the same age as Hitler. His regime, though, was already dead. A puppet state propped up by German soldiers was all that remained. With him was Clara, known as Claretta, Petacci. She was 33 years old, vibrant, intelligent, and absolutely devoted to Mussolini. She had been his mistress for 12 years. That relationship had survived wars, scandals, and the complete overthrow of his regime. When German forces rescued Mussolini from Italian captivity in 1943 and installed him as head of a puppet state in northern Italy, Claretta had followed. She refused to leave him. By late April 1945, the end was undeniable. Allied forces were advancing rapidly. Partisan groups, communist and socialist fighters who had spent years resisting German occupation, were rising up throughout northern Italy. Mussolini's situation was untenable. He made the decision to flee northward toward Austria, hoping to reach safety with the Germans or possibly cross into Switzerland. On April 25, 1945, Mussolini and Claretta fled Milan. They drove north in the Alfa Romeo sports car that Mussolini had bought as a gift for his mistress years earlier, a beautiful car that stood out on the roads. With them came other fascist leaders and German soldiers. On April 27th, the convoy was stopped by partisan forces near the village of Dongo on Lake Como. Mussolini tried a disguise. He wore a German Luftwaffe helmet and overcoat, hoping to pass as a soldier. It didn't work. He was recognized. Claretta demanded to be arrested with him. Witnesses noted that she appeared more resolved than he did. She refused to be separated from Mussolini. The partisans held the pair overnight at a farmhouse, the De Maria farmhouse at Bonzanigo di Mezzegra on the shores of Lake Como. This was their final night together, though neither may have fully understood it at the time. Claretta reportedly asked to be executed alongside Mussolini if that was their fate. She spent the night with him in that farmhouse. Mussolini, witnesses noted, seemed to vacillate between hope and despair. He spoke of escape possibilities. He spoke of negotiations. At one point, he told his captors that if they released him, he would give them an empire, a desperate offer from a man who no longer possessed anything. Claretta seemed clearer-eyed about their situation. She had followed Mussolini this far. She had made her choice to be with him to the end. She had accepted what was coming. They slept that night, or tried to. At the farmhouse on the shores of the lake they had tried to flee across, outside the sounds of war continued. German forces were still fighting the advancing Allies. Partisan groups controlled the landscape. There was no escape route left. In the early hours of April 28th, partisan leaders arrived at the farmhouse. A summary trial was conducted, a mockery of legal proceeding lasting only minutes. Mussolini was accused of war crimes, economic devastation, and crimes against the Italian people. Claretta was listed as his accomplice. Both were sentenced to death. When Mussolini heard the sentence, he reportedly began to plead. He offered deals. He claimed he could negotiate with Allied forces. He tried to bargain for his life. One witness recorded his words. He promised to give them an empire if they would spare him. The partisan leaders were unmoved. Claretta's response was different. She reportedly stood and argued with them. She protested the manner of execution. She insisted they could not be killed like common criminals. Her protests were fierce and dignified. She refused to accept the verdict quietly. They were told they would be transported to another location for execution. The exact circumstances of their death remain contested by historians, disputed by families, and argued about even now. Multiple accounts exist. Some contradict one another. What is undisputed is that on April 28, 1945, late in the afternoon, both Mussolini and Claretta Petacci were taken to the village of Giulino di Mezzegra and shot by partisan forces. One account from a partisan commander named Walter Audicio, who may have personally executed them, described the scene. They were taken to the wall outside a villa. Mussolini was told to stand before the wall. Claretta was beside him. Mussolini is reported to have realized then, seeing the rifles being readied, what was about to happen. According to some versions, he cried out, "No! No!" Those may have been his final words. Other accounts suggest he tried to shield Claretta. Another version says he grabbed her hand. One witness claimed Mussolini shouted, "Shoot me in the chest," as if maintaining dignity through the manner of his death mattered. Another recalled him saying, "Aim for my heart." Claretta is said to have resisted. One account states she tried to shield Mussolini. Another version claims she tried to embrace him. Yet another suggests she stood defiantly, cursing her executioners, refusing to beg or plead as Mussolini reportedly did. She was reported to have cried out that this was not how it should happen, that they could not be executed like this. The rifles fired. Mussolini fell. Claretta fell. Both died in a small village on the shore of the lake they had tried to cross to escape. But their final ordeal was not yet finished. Their bodies were placed in a truck, tossed in like garbage, along with 16 other executed fascist leaders. They were transported to Milan. In the early hours of April 29th, the bodies were dumped onto the cobblestones of Piazzale Loreto, a major public square. The choice of location was deliberate. A year earlier, German forces had left the bodies of 15 executed partisans in this same square as a warning to the populace. Now, Milan's partisans were returning the favor. They arranged the bodies in a row and announced their presence to the crowd. What happened next would be captured in photographs that would circulate around the world. Hundreds of Milan citizens gathered. Clerks stopped work. Shop owners closed their stores. Men, women, and children came to see the bodies of their hated dictator and his mistress. They came to desecrate them. A woman whose sons had been killed by the fascist regime approached Mussolini's body. She fired 5 bullets into it, shouting with each shot, "For my 5 dead sons!" Another woman spat on the corpses. Men kicked them. The crowd surged back and forth, trampling the bodies. Partisan guards had to fire into the air to maintain any semblance of order. The corpses were hung upside down from the metal girders of a petrol station. Photographs show them suspended there. Mussolini, recognizable even in death, his body broken and bloodied from the mob's assault. Beside him hung Claretta Petacci, her dark hair hanging down, her body bruised from the crowd's frenzy. She wore a white blouse with lace ruffles, a detail one witness recorded with strange precision, as if the incongruity of her elegance amid the violence seemed important to note. She was photographed from below, hanging upside down, her body still recognizable as beautiful, even in death. Her skirt had fallen partially away. The sight became one of the most disturbing images of the war's end. Not just the dictator's humiliation, but the display and abuse of the woman who had chosen to stand beside him. What had begun as a final love story in a farmhouse on Lake Como had ended as a grotesque tragedy in a Milan square. Christmas Day execution, the dictator's wife who refused to surrender. While Hitler died in April and Mussolini in the same month, one dictator couple survived the war, but not the revolution. Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu ruled Romania as husband and wife for 24 years. By December 1989, the communist world was collapsing around them. Elena had been born a peasant in 1916. She grew up without formal education, working in textile factories before joining the Communist Party. She would rise to become one of the most powerful women in Eastern Europe. She was ruthless, narcissistic, and absolutely devoted to maintaining power alongside her husband. They styled themselves as partners in the revolution. Though Nicolae held the formal position of dictator, Elena controlled vast apparatuses of state security and propaganda. She accumulated honorary doctorates, most of them fraudulent, and international honors. She demanded recognition as an equal in power, and Nicolae, in his own way, granted it. They had ruled together so long that many Romanians could not imagine Romania without them. By 1989, that stability was cracking. The Soviet Union itself was reforming under Mikhail Gorbachev. The communist regimes of Eastern Europe, propped up by Soviet tanks for 40 years, were wobbling. Poland had moved toward democracy. Hungary was opening its borders. The Iron Curtain was rusting. Nicolae and Elena seemed oblivious. Or perhaps they were so insulated by their security apparatus, so removed from ordinary people, that they genuinely believed their grip remained unshakable. On December 21st, 1989, Nicolae Ceausescu stood before a crowd gathered in front of the Central Committee headquarters in Bucharest to deliver a speech supporting the regime. The event had been carefully orchestrated. Crowds of party officials, security personnel, and state employees had been transported to the square. They were expected to cheer. Placards had been prepared. The choreography of power was familiar. Nicolae began to speak. He talked about the achievements of his regime. He talked about Romania's independence and dignity. But then something unprecedented happened. The crowd did not respond with the expected applause. Instead, voices rose in protest. Some booed, some shouted against him. The noise grew. The carefully orchestrated event collapsed into chaos. For the first time in his 24 years of rule, Nicolae Ceausescu experienced open defiance. His face showed shock and confusion. He stumbled over his words. He tried to continue the speech, but the moment had fundamentally shattered. The crowd's rejection was absolute and irreversible. He could see it in their faces. Fear, yes, but also anger. And worst of all, contempt. They no longer feared him adequately. They no longer cared what he said. Nicolae was led away from the platform. Elena, watching from nearby, reportedly remained composed, but observers noted a change in her demeanor. She understood, perhaps more clearly than her husband, what that moment meant. Their time was ending. Within hours, Nicolae and Elena made the decision to flee Bucharest. They could not control the crowds. The army units they thought would support them were wavering or openly defecting to the revolution. The security forces that had protected them for 24 years were vanishing or turning against them. There was no safe place left in the capital. They made their way to a helicopter. An officer accompanying them later described Nicolae's state. The dictator who had ruled with absolute authority was now a desperate man, barely coherent, asking repeatedly whether it was too late, whether there was anywhere left to go. Elena seemed more focused, more determined. But even she seemed to understand that escape routes were closing. The helicopter lifted off from Bucharest. They flew north and west, searching for somewhere, anywhere, to land where they might find protection, or at least a chance to negotiate. But the revolution was spreading faster than the helicopter could fly. Everywhere they looked, cities were in upheaval. Security forces that might have sheltered them were nowhere to be found. The pilot made a decision. The helicopter could not keep flying indefinitely. It landed near the town of Târgoviște, about 40 miles northwest of Bucharest, at an army barracks. Nicolae and Elena disembarked, thinking perhaps they could find sympathetic military commanders who would protect them, or at least facilitate negotiations. They were wrong. The army unit at the base had already sided with the revolution. Soldiers surrounded them. Nicolae and Elena were placed under arrest. The couple was held at the Targovište barracks from December 22nd to December 25th. During those 4 days, they were kept in separate but adjacent cells, close enough that they might hear one another, but prevented from meaningful contact. Nicolae reportedly experienced what observers described as a psychological breakdown during this period. He alternated between attempts to maintain his dignity and moments of apparent despair. He asked repeatedly about their fate. He tried to convince his captors that negotiations were possible, that deals could be made, that he still had value as a bargaining chip. Elena seemed different. She refused to accept the indignity of captivity. She demanded respect. She insisted on being addressed by her titles. She refused to believe that the situation was truly hopeless. Even in a prison cell, she maintained an air of defiant authority. One guard later described her as insufferable. She insisted on certain standards of treatment, on recognition of her status, even as her world collapsed around her. A commanding officer at the barracks, Colonel, later General, Andrei Petacci, was placed in charge of their custody. Petacci was ordered to protect them and ensure they came to no harm, while authorities decided what to do with them. He took this responsibility seriously. Despite the hatred many soldiers bore toward the couple, Petacci maintained order and discipline in the barracks. No harm was to come to them while in his custody. But events in Bucharest were moving rapidly. The National Salvation Front, a coalition of military officers, intellectuals, and former officials who had split from the regime, was taking control of the capital. They made the decision. Nicolae and Elena would be tried for crimes against the state. Justice would be swift and public. A military tribunal was hastily assembled. A lawyer was assigned, though more as a formality than with any expectation that he could mount a meaningful defense. The trial would take place on Christmas Day itself, a deliberate choice to demonstrate that even the religious calendar would bend to the revolution's will. On the morning of December 25th, 1989, Christmas morning, Nicolae and Elena were transported by armored personnel carrier from their cells to a garrison command office at the Targovište military base. The journey through the barracks was brief. The destination, a hastily prepared courtroom. The defense lawyer met his clients for the first time in that makeshift courtroom. He was given approximately 10 minutes to confer with them. He attempted to explain their options. He suggested they consider pleading insanity to mitigate the death sentence they were almost certain to receive. It was a desperate gambit, a last attempt to preserve their lives. Elena's response was immediate and visceral. She was indignant. She considered the suggestion not merely foolish, but insulting. She insisted on her complete innocence. She rejected the lawyer's help. She would defend herself. She would make them understand their error. Nicolae listened to the lawyer's words with less hostility but equal hopelessness. He seemed to sense what was coming, but was not yet ready to surrender to it entirely. A panel of military judges entered. They took their positions. The trial began. One guard later noted a detail that seemed to him to capture the nature of this proceeding. The only thing on the judge's table was drinking glasses. No files, no documents, no evidence carefully prepared and organized, just glasses for water or coffee. The charges were read aloud: genocide, undermining the national economy, abuse of power. The prosecution presented their case, but critically, there was no comprehensive evidence presented. There were no witness testimonies. There were no carefully prepared documents showing specific crimes. The trial was less a judicial proceeding and more a performance, a ritualistic condemnation masked in legal language. Nicolae and Elena were given the opportunity to respond. This is where their personalities diverged most starkly. Nicolae attempted to explain himself. He talked about his accomplishments. He spoke about economic policies and infrastructure projects. He tried to contextualize his actions within the historical moment he believed he had been leading. His defense was rational, almost professorial. He seemed to be appealing to reason, to logic, to the possibility that they might understand that he had done what he believed was necessary. Elena was different. She was defiant. She interrupted the judges repeatedly. She denied every accusation. She insisted that the entire proceeding was a lie, a manipulation, a travesty. She demanded to know who had authorized this tribunal. She insisted they had no right to try her. She was not merely defending herself. She was attacking the legitimacy of the entire process. She seemed incapable of accepting that the power she had wielded was truly gone, that these people who were now questioning her actually had the authority to do so. The trial proceeded, though it was less trial and more coronation of predetermined judgment. The verdict came quickly, guilty on all counts. The sentence, death by firing squad. The judges, maintaining the pretense of legal procedure, noted that the sentence could be appealed to a higher court. This provision would prove meaningless. The appeals process would be rendered moot by events. Minutes after the verdict was announced, guards entered the courtroom. Nicolae and Elena were informed that the sentence would be carried out immediately. There would be no delay. There would be no opportunity for appeals or negotiations. The execution would happen now, on Christmas Day, December 25th, 1989. Nicolae asked for a cigarette. His request was denied. He was told to prepare himself. Elena reportedly made a final demand for proper respect and proper treatment. She was ignored. They were led from the courtroom down corridors of the garrison building. The walk to the courtyard took only minutes, but those minutes seemed to stretch into an eternity. According to witnesses, Nicolae and Elena were moving toward their deaths, and the reality of it was finally becoming inescapable. Nicolae began to speak as they walked. Accounts from different witnesses vary slightly in their specific details, but the substance remained consistent across all of them. Nicolae spoke about the Romanian people. He spoke about what he believed he had built. He spoke about the legacy he believed he was leaving. As they neared the execution wall, Nicolae began to sing. The words were from the Internationale, the communist anthem, the revolutionary song that had been the soundtrack to his entire political life. He sang the opening verse. Then he raised his voice in a final declaration. He shouted words about the Socialist Republic of Romania, about its independence and its freedom. It was perhaps the truest thing Nicolae could have done, to end not with an apology or an acceptance, but with an assertion of the ideology that had defined him. Even facing death, he refused to renounce the revolution that had given him power. Elena's response told a different story entirely. As they reached the courtyard and she saw the firing squad, 3 paratroopers standing with their rifles raised, the full reality of what was about to happen crashed over her like a physical blow. She struggled. She resisted the soldiers who held her. She had spent 24 years exerting absolute power over everyone around her. She had commanded armies. She had controlled security forces. She had ordered people's deaths. The concept of being unable to command her own fate seemed to be something her mind could not process. Accounts from multiple witnesses describe her alternating between pleading and cursing. She screamed protests at the soldiers. She insisted that they could not tie her up. She demanded that they not offend her, that they not treat her this way. She tried to pull away from the guards. She seemed physically incapable of accepting that this was truly the end. Nicolae, by contrast, seemed almost resigned. He appeared to accept what was coming. Whether this was dignity or despair, witnesses could not agree, but he walked to the wall and stood there without further resistance. Their hands were tied behind their backs. They were positioned against the concrete wall. Nicolae stood upright. Elena continued to struggle and protest even as her hands were being bound. The firing squad raised their rifles. A soldier was asked to give a formal final order. But the execution happened so quickly that no clear command seems to have been given. Perhaps in the chaos, the guard activity, Elena's continued resistance, the confusion of the moment, The order was simply implied. The rifles fired. 70 bullets later, in some accounts, though other sources cite specific numbers like 120 bullets found in the combined bodies, the courtyard erupted into deafening noise. The bodies of Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu fell forward against the wall, collapsing to the ground. Blood stained the concrete. Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu, rulers of Romania for 24 years, were dead. Their final moments had been violent and chaotic, nothing like the composed, philosophical ending of Hitler in his bunker, nothing like Mussolini's swift violence, nothing like the careful goodbyes that had characterized some dictators' departures from power. Instead, they died in a barracks courtyard on Christmas morning, shot to death by a firing squad, their deaths broadcast on the television screens of the nation they had ruled. Within hours, their bodies were photographed. Video footage was recorded. The images were broadcast on Romanian television that same evening. Romanians, who had lived for 24 years under absolute state control, finally saw proof that their dictators were truly gone. The video showed Nicolae and Elena lying on the ground, their bodies still, the walls behind them stained with the violence of their execution. The speed and manner of the execution remained controversial. Many, including some who had opposed the regime, questioned whether justice had been served through such a summary trial. Others, particularly those who had suffered under the regime, saw it as finally, mercifully, the end of oppression. The bodies were taken to a medical facility. They were dissected for autopsy. Then they were buried in unmarked graves at Ghencea Cemetery in Bucharest. Their remains were not returned to family. There would be no elaborate state funeral. There would be no monument. Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu were interred as criminals, their deaths marking not the end of a dynasty or the conclusion of a grand historical narrative, but the collapse of a system that had promised so much and delivered so much suffering. In the days and weeks following their execution, the full extent of their regime's crimes began to emerge. Hundreds had been killed during the revolution itself. Thousands had died in prisons and labor camps over the 24 years of their rule. Torture and deprivation had been systematic. Control had been absolute. The machinery of oppression had been pervasive. Elena, who had demanded respect even as she was being executed, would receive none in death. Her memory would be associated with vanity, cruelty, and contempt for human dignity. Nicolae, who sang the Internationale in his final moments, would be remembered as a despot who had perverted communist ideals into a nightmare. The final 24 hours of these women, Eva Braun, Claretta Petacci, and Elena Ceausescu, reveal the profound human drama beneath historical headlines. Eva chose poison and bullets over capture. Claretta died trying to shield the man she loved. Elena fought until the final second, refusing to accept the end that had come for her and her husband. 3 women, 3 different nations, 3 different responses to mortality. Yet each faced the same ultimate reality, that power, devotion, ideology, and love could not prevent the moment when everything collapsed into personal ruin. The dictators are remembered. But so too are the women who stood beside them, whose final hours became as significant as their lives, who faced their endings with varying degrees of courage, defiance, and desperation. Their stories endure not as glorification, but as historical testament to the consequences of absolute power and the terrible human costs of totalitarianism. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the History Sagas channel so you never miss more compelling and untold stories from history. Thank you for watching.